June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. Oberst Hans von Luck stood in the bell tower of a Norman church 5 kilometers inland from the invasion beaches, binoculars pressed to his eyes as dawn broke across the English Channel. What he witnessed in those first moments would fundamentally alter German understanding of American industrial capacity and render their careful casualty reporting systems meaningless. The sea had disappeared. In its place stretched an unbroken horizon of ships, thousands of vessels extending beyond visual range in every direction. Von Luck, a veteran of Poland, France, North Africa, and the Eastern Front, had seen amphibious operations before. This was something entirely different. This was industrial warfare manifested as physical reality, and among the equipment now pouring onto French soil were American tanks in quantities that exceeded Germany's entire armoured inventory on the Western Front. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Allied forces landed approximately 50,000 vehicles of all types across the Normandy beaches in the first week of Operation Overlord. Among these were roughly 2,000 tanks, the majority being American M4 Shermans. By the end of June, that number would exceed 4,000 operational tanks on French soil. By the end of July, American and British armoured divisions fielded more tanks in Normandy than Germany possessed on the entire Western Front, from the Swiss border to the English Channel. German tank commanders, trained to meticulously document every loss and report tank strength with precision, began encountering a problem that rendered their reporting systems absurd. Destroying American tanks accomplished nothing strategically, because replacements arrived faster than German forces could eliminate them. The careful accounting that allowed German high command to track armoured strength and allocate reserves became meaningless when the enemy's production capacity exceeded your destruction capacity by orders of magnitude. The story of how German commanders stopped reporting losses after Normandy wasn't about despair or defeatism, though those emotions certainly existed. It was about the collision between German military precision and American industrial reality. German doctrine assumed that armoured warfare was a chess match where each piece mattered and careful accounting determined victory. American logistics demonstrated that armoured warfare was actually an industrial problem, where production capacity and replacement rates determined outcomes regardless of tactical skill. The German army in June 1944 operated under assumptions forged in earlier campaigns where material balance mattered and careful resource management made strategic difference. The Wehrmacht had defeated Poland with fewer than 3,000 tanks. They had crushed France while suffering substantial armour losses that mattered strategically because German industry couldn't rapidly replace them. They had invaded the Soviet Union with approximately 3,000 tanks, knowing that each loss reduced combat power that couldn't be quickly restored. This assumption that tanks were limited resources, requiring careful preservation, shaped German tactical doctrine, operational planning, and strategic thinking. Tank units received explicit orders to avoid unnecessary exposure. Commanders faced consequences for losses deemed preventable. Staff officers tracked every tank's location, mechanical status, and combat readiness because this information determined what operations were feasible. The reporting system reflected this philosophy. Each Panzer division maintained detailed strength reports, updated daily. These documents listed every tank by type and unit assignment, noting which were operational, which required repair, and which were total losses. Battalion commanders reported upward to regiment, regiments reported to division, divisions reported to corps, and corps reported to army group. This chain of reporting allowed German high command to know with reasonable precision how many tanks were available at any location. This system had worked adequately when Germany fought enemies with similar or inferior production capacity. Against Poland, France, and Britain in the early war years, German tank losses could be tracked meaningfully because Allied production couldn't overwhelm German replacement capacity. Against the Soviet Union, despite massive Russian tank production, German forces achieved tactical superiority that made careful accounting strategically relevant. Normandy destroyed these assumptions completely. The sheer scale of American logistics made German accounting systems absurd. Staff officers discovered that destroying 50 American tanks in a Successful ambush accomplished nothing because 60 replacement tanks arrived within days. Reporting that your battalion had knocked out 12 Shermans during a defensive action seemed impressive until intelligence reported that the same American battalion fielded 15 tanks the following morning, more than before the engagement began. Major Hans von Luck, serving with the 21st Panzer Division in Normandy, later described the psychological impact in post-war interviews. He explained that German commanders quickly learned that tactical victories measured by enemy tanks destroyed were strategically meaningless. You could win every engagement, destroy more tanks than you lost, maintain superior kill ratios, and still lose ground steadily because American replacement rates exceeded German destruction rates. The supply situation for German forces illustrated the disparity. Panzer Lehr Division, considered one of Germany's elite armoured formations, landed in Normandy with approximately 183 tanks and self-propelled guns. This represented its full authorized strength after careful preparation and priority allocation of scarce resources. The division received replacement tanks at a rate of perhaps 10 to 15 vehicles monthly when supply lines functioned, which became increasingly rare as Allied air power dominated the rear areas. American armored divisions in Normandy operated differently. The typical American armored division fielded roughly 263 tanks at full strength, 168 M4 Shermans in 3 tank battalions, and 95 in attached units. But the critical difference wasn't initial strength, it was replacement capacity. American divisions received replacement tanks at rates that German logistics officers literally could not believe when they captured supply documents. Captured American logistics paperwork documented delivery schedules that seemed impossible. One captured manifest from late June showed that 7th Corps, a single American corps, expected delivery of 190 replacement tanks during the last week of June. German officers examining these documents assumed they were disinformation because no army they had fought possessed such replacement capacity. The documents were accurate. American logistics in Normandy delivered tanks to frontline units faster than the units could integrate them into operations. The build-up pace was staggering. On June 6th, D-Day itself, approximately 750 tanks landed despite the chaos of the initial assault. By June 12th, 6 days after the invasion, roughly 3,000 tanks were operational in Normandy. By June 30th, the number exceeded 6,500 tanks, including British and Canadian forces. By the end of July, Allied tank strength in Normandy approached 8,000 operational vehicles, despite continuous combat losses. German forces faced this avalanche with deteriorating armour strength. The entire German 7th Army and Panzer Group West defending Normandy possessed approximately 1,500 tanks and assault guns on June 6th. This force faced 6 Allied divisions on D-Day, growing to 39 Allied divisions by the end of July, each supported by armour in quantities Germany could not match. The production numbers told the strategic story with brutal clarity. German tank production in June 1944 totaled approximately 860 vehicles of all types across all German factories. This included Panthers, Tigers, Panzer IVs, and assault guns. American production in June 1944 delivered approximately 2,100 Sherman tanks alone, not counting other armoured vehicle types. Soviet production added roughly 2,400 tanks monthly. Britain contributed approximately 500 monthly. Germany faced a mathematical impossibility. Even if German forces achieved perfect tactical performance, destroying 2 Allied tanks for every German loss, a ratio that proved unsustainable in Normandy's fighting, the Allies could replace losses twice over, while German replacements barely covered 1/3 of losses. The numbers made German victory impossible regardless of tactical skill or operational brilliance. The reporting crisis emerged gradually as commanders realized the futility of standard documentation. Early Normandy reports followed traditional format, listing enemy tanks destroyed alongside friendly losses. But within weeks, the absurdity became apparent. You reported destroying 30 tanks yesterday, then intelligence reported the same enemy unit at full strength this morning. You documented your battalion had knocked out 60 enemy tanks over 2 weeks, then found yourself retreating because the enemy had more tanks than when fighting began. Oberst Hans commanding Panzer Group West, confronted this problem directly in late June. His staff prepared a situation report documenting that German forces had destroyed approximately 450 Allied tanks since D-Day, while losing 180 German tanks. Traditional analysis suggested a favorable exchange ratio demonstrating tactical superiority, but Eberbach's intelligence section simultaneously reported that Allied tank strength had increased by roughly 3,000 vehicles in the same period. The math was devastating. German forces were winning every tactical engagement by traditional metrics while losing the campaign catastrophically because Allied replacement rates rendered tactical victories meaningless. Eberbach reportedly threw the report on his desk and asked his chief of staff what the point was of counting enemy losses when they had more tanks today than yesterday, regardless of how many you destroyed. The breakdown in reporting standards began with individual company and battalion commanders who simply stopped filing detailed enemy loss reports. What was the point? You ambushed an American column, destroyed 8 tanks, withdrew successfully, and considered it a victory. Then the Americans returned the next day with 12 tanks, more than before you had defeated them. Reporting the engagement as a successful defensive action seemed absurd when the enemy was stronger afterward than before. This informal abandonment of standard reporting procedures spread upward through the command structure. Regimental commanders stopped demanding detailed enemy loss figures from battalions. Division commanders stopped emphasizing enemy tank counts in their reports to corps. Corps commanders began focusing their reports on German strength and operational capability rather than enemy losses, because only German numbers actually mattered strategically. By mid-July, many German reports from Normandy simply noted, "Heavy enemy armor present," or "Enemy tank strength remains high," without specific numbers. This represented a fundamental shift from German military precision culture. The Wehrmacht prided itself on accurate reporting and meticulous documentation. Officers faced consequences for inaccurate reports. Yet in Normandy, accurate enemy loss reporting had become impossible because the fundamental assumption that destroying enemy equipment reduced enemy capability no longer applied. The psychological impact on German commanders was profound. Wehrmacht officers were trained to believe that tactical skill and operational excellence could overcome material disadvantages. German forces had frequently defeated larger enemy formations through superior tactics and better trained crews. This confidence rested on the assumption that tactical victories accumulated into strategic advantage. Normandy destroyed that assumption completely. You could execute perfect ambushes, achieve superior kill ratios, fight with exceptional skill, and still lose ground steadily because the enemy's industrial capacity overwhelmed your tactical excellence. German commanders discovered that in modern industrial warfare, against an enemy with overwhelming production capacity, tactical skill became largely irrelevant. The Allies could afford to lose badly in individual engagements because they simply returned with more equipment. The situation reports from German units reflected growing awareness that traditional combat metrics were meaningless. A report from the 2nd SS Panzer Corps dated July 15th noted that the Corps had destroyed an estimated 300 Allied tanks since June 6th, while losing 92 German tanks. The report then observed that despite this favorable exchange ratio, Allied tank superiority had increased substantially during the same period, and the Corps recommended against emphasizing enemy loss figures as measures of success because they bore no relationship to actual enemy capability. This represented heresy in German military culture. Acknowledging that killing more enemy than you lost was strategically meaningless contradicted fundamental Wehrmacht doctrine. But commanders in Normandy were confronting reality that couldn't be explained away. The Americans simply had tanks in quantities that made destruction rates irrelevant. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The comparison with Eastern Front experience made the situation even more painful for German commanders. On the Russian front, German forces faced Soviet tank production that exceeded German output by substantial margins. Soviet T-34 production alone reached approximately 25,000 units annually by 1943. Yet German forces maintained some strategic relevance because Soviet logistics struggled to maintain operational tank strength at the front. Soviet tanks broke down frequently, required extensive maintenance, and suffered from inadequate spare parts supply. This meant that although Soviet production was massive, actual tank strength at the front line was often limited. American logistics in Normandy operated at entirely different standards. Sherman tanks reached frontline units fully fueled, fully armed, mechanically sound, and ready for immediate combat operations. Maintenance units followed close behind combat formations with complete sets of spare parts. Damaged tanks were recovered rapidly, repaired efficiently, and returned to service within days. American logistics didn't just deliver tanks, it maintained operational readiness at rates German forces had never achieved with their own equipment. German maintenance capabilities were collapsing by comparison. Panther and Tiger tanks required extensive specialized maintenance that was difficult to perform under field conditions. Spare parts were chronically short, qualified mechanics were scarce. Damaged tanks often couldn't be recovered because Allied air superiority made daytime recovery operations suicidal. The result was steadily declining operational readiness among German armor units, even when total tank numbers remained stable on paper. By late July, typical German Panzer divisions reported operational readiness below 40%. This meant that a division authorized 200 tanks might have only 70 to 80 actually capable of combat operations. The remainder were awaiting parts, undergoing repair, or simply broken down beyond field repair capability. American armored divisions during the same period maintained operational readiness above 70%, and lost tanks were replaced so quickly that divisions frequently operated above authorized strength. The Panzer Lehr division's experience illustrated the impossible mathematics. The division entered Normandy on June 7th with full strength of approximately 180 tanks. By July 25th, after 7 weeks of continuous combat, the division reported fewer than 40 operational tanks despite receiving approximately 30 replacement vehicles. Combat losses, mechanical failures, and limited recovery capability had reduced an elite formation to combat ineffective status. Meanwhile, American divisions that had fought equally hard maintained near full strength through the continuous flow of replacements. The German commander's frustration was captured in situation reports that grew increasingly blunt about material realities. A report from 5th Panzer Army dated July 28 noted that tactical success was impossible when the enemy could accept any loss level and return to full strength within days, while German forces required weeks to integrate, even small numbers of replacement tanks. The report recommended that higher headquarters stop using enemy tank destruction figures as measures of operational success because they bore no relationship to actual enemy capability decline. This recommendation was ignored. German high command, particularly officers, far from the front who had not witnessed the industrial avalanche themselves, continued demanding traditional reporting metrics. They wanted to know enemy loss figures, because those numbers had always mattered in previous campaigns. Commanders in Normandy increasingly provided estimates rather than verified counts, because verifying enemy losses was impossible when the enemy simply returned with more equipment than before. The intelligence crisis compounded the reporting problem. German intelligence officers attempting to track Allied armor strength found themselves unable to produce coherent assessments. Standard methodology involved tracking identified units, estimating their strength based on combat observations, and adjusting estimates based on reported losses. This methodology collapsed when enemy units appeared at full strength days after reportedly suffering heavy losses. Intelligence reports from late July began, including caveats acknowledging that Allied tank strength estimates were highly uncertain because replacement rates exceeded the intelligence section's ability to track. Some reports simply noted that Allied armor was present in overwhelming strength without attempting precise numbers. This represented professional failure for intelligence officers, trained to provide commanders with accurate enemy strength data, but accurate assessment had become impossible when the enemy's logistics made strength estimates obsolete within days. The situation worsened dramatically after Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy beginning July 25. The operation demonstrated American material superiority at a scale that made continued resistance seem pointless to many German commanders. Over 1,500 American heavy bombers carpet-bombed German positions, followed by massed artillery barrages, followed by armoured columns that simply drove through the shattered defences. German forces opposing Cobra were outnumbered roughly 3-1 in armour. They faced continuous air attack that made daytime movement suicidal. Their supply lines were interdicted constantly, and even when they achieved local tactical successes, destroying American tanks in well-executed ambushes, the Americans returned hours later with fresh equipment. The psychological impact was crushing. Major General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr Division during Cobra, later described the experience as fighting against an opponent who viewed tanks as expendable. He noted that American commanders seemed indifferent to tank losses because they knew replacements would arrive within days. This created tactical behavior that German officers found baffling. American units would accept heavy losses in frontal attacks because they could afford the exchange rate. German units had to preserve their limited armor because losses were irreplaceable. The breakout triggered what German reports called a tank crisis that made reporting standards completely collapse. As American armored columns raced through Brittany and toward Paris, German commanders simply stopped attempting to track enemy armor strength. Reports noted numerous enemy tanks or heavy enemy armor concentration without numbers because numbers were meaningless. Whether the Americans had 50 tanks or 500 in a particular sector made little practical difference when reinforcements arrived continuously. The traffic analysis of German military communications during August 1944 shows the reporting breakdown clearly. Message traffic that previously included detailed strength figures and enemy loss estimates increasingly used vague qualitative descriptions. Enemy armor, strength overwhelming, appeared frequently. Our tank strength inadequate for mission became standard phrasing. Specific numbers disappeared from many reports because commanders recognized that precision was impossible and estimates were worthless. The fuel crisis compounded every problem. German armor operations in Normandy were increasingly constrained by fuel shortages as Allied air power interdicted supply lines. A Panther tank consumed approximately 400 litres of fuel per 100 kilometres under ideal conditions. Combat operations increased consumption substantially. Fuel supplies that were barely adequate when German armour could move relatively freely became catastrophically short when every movement required enormous fuel expenditure due to detours and cross-country travel to avoid Allied air attack. American logistics delivered fuel in quantities that made German constraints seem absurd. A single American armoured division consumed approximately 300,000 litres of fuel daily during active operations. American logistics delivered this fuel reliably, despite operating across the English Channel and through portable pipelines that seemed fantastical to German observers. Captured American supply dumps contained fuel reserves that exceeded entire German Army Group allocations. The quality difference in logistics infrastructure became painfully apparent as German forces retreated eastward. American supply lines lengthened across France, but remained functional, because American engineering units built infrastructure, improved roads, constructed bridges, laid pipeline at rates German forces couldn't match. German supply lines shortened as forces fell back toward Germany, but functionality declined because Allied air interdiction destroyed bridges, cratered roads, and made daylight transport suicidal. By late August, many German armoured units were effectively immobilized, not by combat damage, but by fuel shortages. A formation might have 30 operational tanks but insufficient fuel to move them more than 50 kilometers. Meanwhile, American armored divisions raced hundreds of kilometers, pausing only when their own supply lines temporarily stretched too thin, then resuming advances as soon as logistics caught up. The reporting crisis reached its peak during the Falaise pocket encirclement in August. German forces trapped in the pocket fought desperately to escape, abandoning equipment wholesale when fuel ran out or routes became impassable. Traditional accounting broke down completely. Units lost contact with higher headquarters. Individual tanks and crews escaped independently rather than as organized formations. Equipment was destroyed deliberately to prevent capture rather than lost to enemy action. The after-action reports from German units that escaped the Falaise pocket were sparse and vague about tank losses. Many simply noted that the division had withdrawn with minimal armor strength, without specifying how many tanks were lost or how. This wasn't negligence, it was honest acknowledgement that accounting was impossible in the chaos and meaningless given the scale of material losses. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps reported that it had withdrawn with negligible tank strength and would require substantial reconstitution without providing specific numbers. The 1st SS Panzer Corps report was similarly vague. German High Command initially reacted with fury to these imprecise reports, demanding detailed accounting of lost equipment so that replacement priorities could be established. But field commanders pushed back, explaining that precise accounting was impossible given the circumstances, and that replacement allocation should be based on operational requirements rather than careful accounting of losses that were predominantly due to fuel shortage and abandonment rather than combat. This exchange represented a fundamental clash between traditional German military precision and the new reality of industrial warfare. High Command wanted detailed reports because German logistics required precise allocation of scarce resources. Field commanders argued that precision was impossible and meaningless when the enemy's logistics made German accounting seem absurd by comparison. The comparison with German tank production made the situation even more hopeless. German industry in August 1944 produced approximately 670 tanks of all types. This represented substantial production given Germany's circumstances, Allied bombing, raw material shortages, and labour difficulties. But the production was utterly inadequate to replace losses in Normandy while simultaneously supporting operations on the Eastern Front, in Italy, and maintaining strategic reserves. American production in August 1944 delivered approximately 1,900 Sherman tanks, plus hundreds of tank destroyers and other armoured vehicles. Soviet production exceeded 2,000 tanks. Britain contributed several hundred. The combined Allied production was roughly 6 times German output, and while German production was declining due to strategic bombing and resource shortages, Allied production remained stable or increased. The personnel situation compounded the material imbalance. German armoured forces were losing experienced crews faster than training programs could replace them. A Tiger tank crew required months of training to achieve combat effectiveness. Panther crews needed weeks of familiarization with the complex vehicle. Replacement crews arriving in France by late summer 1944 often had minimal training, sometimes measured in days rather than weeks, because the training system couldn't keep pace with losses. American armoured training pipelines delivered crews with adequate preparation and continuing training behind the lines. American doctrine assumed that initial training provided baseline competence and that crews would improve through experience. German doctrine had traditionally assumed lengthy training created superior crews who could compensate for material inferiority. But by late 1944, German training time had collapsed while American training remained stable. The quality comparison that had favoured Germany early in the war had reversed. By autumn 1944, average American tank crews had more training and more experience than average German crews. The Wehrmacht's edge in crew quality, which had partially compensated for inferior tank numbers in earlier campaigns, had disappeared. German forces now faced enemies who were more numerous, better equipped, and equally or better trained. The psychological impact on German commanders manifested in reports that grew increasingly pessimistic about operational possibilities. A situation report from Army Group B, dated September 9th, noted that armoured operations were feasible only when local tank superiority could be achieved, but achieving superiority was impossible given Allied material advantages. The report recommended that German armour be held in reserve for counterattacks rather than committed to defensive lines because defensive use simply exposed tanks to Allied firepower, superiority, without accomplishing strategic objectives. This represented a profound shift in German armoured doctrine. The Panzer arm had been designed as an offensive weapon for breakthrough operations and exploitation. Using armour defensively as a fire brigade to seal breakthroughs had always been considered inefficient. But by September 1944, German commanders recognized that offensive operations were impossible when the enemy possessed overwhelming material superiority. Armor could only be used reactively to prevent complete collapse. Even this limited role became increasingly difficult as Allied air superiority made daylight movement suicidal. German armored units could only move at night, limiting operational flexibility and making rapid concentration impossible. American armored units operated continuously, with close air support, that devastated any German force caught in the open. The combination of material inferiority and air superiority meant German armor was combat effective only in very limited circumstances. The reporting standards by autumn 1944 had shifted completely from the precision documentation that characterized German military culture. Division strength reports listed operational tank counts without attempting to track enemy losses. Corps reports noted heavy enemy pressure without enemy strength estimates. Army reports focused on German combat power and operational possibilities rather than enemy capabilities because enemy capabilities were so overwhelmingly superior that detailed assessment was pointless. This shift represented institutional acknowledgement that traditional metrics were meaningless in industrial warfare against an opponent with decisive material advantages. German military doctrine had always emphasized that determination, training, and tactical skill could overcome material disadvantages. Normandy proved this belief wrong when material disadvantages reached certain thresholds. No amount of skill could compensate for 10-to-1 disadvantages in operational tank strength, combined with complete enemy air superiority and unlimited enemy logistics. The final abandonment of traditional reporting came with the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. German High Command assembled substantial armoured forces for the surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, concentrating approximately 650 tanks and assault guns. This represented the largest German armoured concentration on the Western Front since Normandy. The operation initially achieved surprise and made substantial gains, but even this carefully husbanded force, assembled through months of effort and representing a significant portion of Germany's remaining armoured strength, proved inadequate when American reinforcements arrived. Within days, American forces had moved more armoured divisions to the Ardennes than Germany had committed to the entire offensive. The rapid American response demonstrated, again, that operational success was impossible when the enemy could concentrate armour faster than you could exploit success. German reports from the Ardennes offensive abandoned precision completely. Situation reports noted that Allied armour was arriving in large numbers or concentrating in threatening strength without attempting quantification. Intelligence estimates acknowledged that Allied tank numbers were unknown, but certainly sufficient to contain German advances. Even victory reports noting tactical successes included caveats that American reinforcement rates would likely restore the situation within days. The offensive failed for multiple reasons, but the material imbalance was decisive. German forces couldn't sustain operations because fuel supplies were inadequate. They couldn't maneuver freely because Allied air power, grounded by weather initially, returned with devastating effect as soon as weather cleared. And they couldn't exploit success because American reinforcements arrived faster than German forces could advance. By January 1945, German armoured reporting had devolved to simple operational readiness statements. Division reports listed how many tanks were operational today without historical context or enemy strength assessments. The future was irrelevant because everyone understood that operational strength would decline regardless of tactical outcomes. The past was irrelevant because yesterday's successful engagement meant nothing when the enemy appeared today at full strength. The contrast with June 1944 was stark. 8 months earlier, German reports meticulously documented every enemy tank destroyed and carefully tracked Allied strength build-up. By January 1945, reports simply stated current German strength and acknowledged that operations were constrained by material shortages rather than enemy capability, because enemy capability was so overwhelming that detailed assessment accomplished nothing. The institutional knowledge that reporting enemy losses was meaningless spread through the Wehrmacht's armoured forces and created lasting changes in how German officers thought about industrial warfare. Post-war interviews with German commanders repeatedly emphasized that Normandy taught them that production capacity determined modern warfare outcomes more decisively than tactical skill. Many expressed belief that Germany lost World War II not on battlefields but in factories, and that improved tactics or operational excellence could never have overcome Allied industrial superiority. Oberst Hans von Luck, who witnessed the invasion from his church tower in June 1944, survived the war and wrote extensively about his experiences. He noted that within days of the invasion, experienced officers recognized that tactical competence was inadequate against an enemy who could lose battles repeatedly, yet grow stronger, while German forces won battles yet grew weaker. The realization was psychologically devastating because it meant that individual courage and skill were strategically irrelevant. General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops, toured the Western Front in late summer 1944 and was briefed by commanders who explained that standard reporting metrics were meaningless given Allied material superiority. Guderian reportedly argued initially that precise reporting remained essential for resource allocation, but after witnessing the logistics disparity personally, he acknowledged that traditional accounting made little sense when the enemy replaced losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The production comparison that made traditional reporting absurd extended beyond tanks to encompass all equipment categories. Allied artillery ammunition expenditure in Normandy exceeded German production capacity. Allied truck production allowed motorization of infantry at scales Germany couldn't match. Allied aircraft production created air superiority so complete that German daylight operations became suicidal. The material imbalance affected every aspect of combat operations. The final irony was that German tactical performance in Normandy was often excellent by traditional measures. German forces frequently achieved superior kill ratios, destroying more Allied tanks per engagement than they lost. German defensive tactics were sophisticated and effective. German commanders demonstrated operational skill throughout the campaign. None of it mattered because Allied material superiority overwhelmed tactical excellence. A Canadian military analysis conducted after the war examined German tactical performance in Normandy and concluded that Wehrmacht forces often outfought Allied units on a tactical level, yet lost the campaign decisively because tactics couldn't overcome logistics. The analysis noted that German after-action reports increasingly emphasized material factors rather than tactical assessments, suggesting that German commanders understood they were fighting an unwinnable campaign where success was measured by survival rather than victory. The legacy of the reporting breakdown extended into post-war military thinking about industrial capacity and logistics. NATO doctrine during the Cold War emphasized that sustainable logistics and production capacity were essential for modern warfare, and that tactical excellence alone was insufficient if the enemy possessed material superiority. This represented lessons learned directly from Wehrmacht experience in Normandy. The German commanders who stopped reporting losses after seeing the Sherman tide at Normandy weren't giving up or acting unprofessionally. They were acknowledging reality that traditional military accounting couldn't address. When your enemy produces tanks faster than you can destroy them, counting enemy losses becomes an exercise in futility. When tactical victories fail to reduce enemy capability, reporting those victories as successes becomes absurd. When material imbalance reaches certain thresholds, precision documentation of combat outcomes provides no useful information for decision-making. The Wehrmacht in 1944 learned what many military forces have learned throughout history, that industrial capacity is itself a weapon, perhaps the most decisive weapon in prolonged modern warfare. German commanders stopped reporting losses not because they were incompetent or demoralized, but because they recognized that in industrial warfare against an opponent with overwhelming production advantages, traditional combat metrics were strategically meaningless. The Americans could afford to lose every tactical engagement, yet win the campaign through sheer material superiority. This realization that production capacity could overwhelm tactical skill represented a fundamental challenge to military professionalism. Officers trained to believe that leadership, training, and tactical excellence determined outcomes had to confront evidence that industrial capacity mattered more. The psychological adjustment was difficult for many German commanders who took pride in professional competence, yet found that competence inadequate against enemies who simply had more of everything. The story of German commanders abandoning standard reporting in Normandy illustrates how industrial warfare transforms military operations. Tactics, operations, and strategy all become subordinate to logistics and production when material imbalances reach decisive levels. The careful accounting that allows military organizations to track strength and allocate resources becomes meaningless when one side's replacement rates exceed the other side's destruction capacity. The 50,000 vehicles that landed at Normandy, including thousands of Sherman tanks that kept coming regardless of how many were destroyed, represented American industrial power manifested as military capability. German commanders stopped reporting losses because those reports couldn't capture the fundamental reality that they were fighting an enemy for whom individual equipment losses were irrelevant. Details in a logistics system that produced war material faster than it could be destroyed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.